Timothy Wayne Adams was not a name known to many outside of Houston, Texas, before 2002. He was, to most who met him, an ordinary man. He worked as a security guard, kept to himself, and seemed no different from countless other working-class men trying to raise a family. But in February of that year, his name would become burned into the memory of Texas crime history. His story is one of unbearable tragedy, of love twisted by rage, and of a decision so devastating that it left not only one child dead, but an entire family and a community shattered. Adams was born in 1968. He grew up in Houston and was remembered by classmates and colleagues as polite, soft-spoken, even quiet. He was not the kind of man people feared, nor the type that stood out as dangerous. In fact, those who knew him in adulthood often described him as devoted to his young son. But beneath that exterior, Adams carried a possessiveness and a pride that, when combined with heartbreak and despair, would erupt in violence. By the early 2000s, Adams had been living with his girlfriend, Bridget, and their child, Timothy Jr., who was only 19 months old. To outsiders, they looked like a family starting out, but inside their relationship, cracks were forming. Arguments became frequent. Bridget confided to friends that she felt trapped, that Adams was controlling, and that she wanted to leave. Eventually, she made the decision to end the relationship. For Adams, the thought of losing both his partner and custody of his only child was unbearable. His despair began to turn into a deadly resolve. On February 20th, 2002, inside his apartment at the Commonwealth Apartments in Houston, Timothy Adams made a choice that would devastate everyone around him. Armed with a gun and with his baby son in the apartment, he found himself barricaded inside as police began to surround the building. Neighbors had heard gunshots and called 911. Officers arrived quickly and realized this was not a routine call. They were facing a father, armed, unstable, and holding a toddler. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted hours. Police negotiators tried everything. They spoke to Adams by phone. They begged him to come out peacefully, and they reminded him of the innocence of the child in his arms. Friends and family members stood outside, pleading for him to end the standoff without bloodshed. Adams told officers he was overwhelmed, that he could not face losing his family, that he saw no future for himself. To negotiators, he sounded trapped in his own hopelessness. But inside that apartment, his emotions were spiraling into something darker. Officers would later testify that he spoke with a strange calmness, as if he had already decided what he was going to do. And then, in a moment that horrified even seasoned law enforcement veterans, Timothy Wayne Adams turned the gun on his 19-month-old son and pulled the trigger. The baby, Timothy Jr., was killed instantly. When officers finally entered the apartment and took Adams into custody, the scene they found was one that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. A father sitting beside the body of his son. A crime so senseless, so devastating, that hardened detectives were reduced to tears. The news spread quickly across Houston, and the public reaction was one of disbelief. How could a father, someone meant to protect and nurture his child, choose instead to end his life? Neighbors spoke of seeing Adams play with his son, of watching him beam with pride as he carried the little boy outside. The contradiction between the loving father they thought they knew and the killer who emerged that night was almost impossible to reconcile. When the case went to trial, the prosecution spared no detail. They described a man consumed by selfishness and anger, unwilling to allow anyone else to raise his son, and determined to make sure that if he could not keep the boy, no one could. They emphasized that Adams had hours to reconsider, hours to hand the child to safety, but he never did. They told the jury that this was not a sudden moment of madness. It was a deliberate, conscious choice to kill. The defense painted a different picture. They portrayed Adams as a broken man, driven to desperation by the collapse of his family. They argued that he loved his son, but in his despair, his love became distorted. They pleaded with the jury to consider the emotional turmoil, to see a man who lost control in a moment of unbearable pain. But the jury could not look past the brutality of the crime. The victim was a baby, a child who had no chance to run, no chance to fight back. For the jurors, that innocence demanded the harshest possible sentence. In 2002, Timothy Wayne Adams was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For nearly a decade, he sat on Texas death row. His appeals wound their way through the courts, each one failing to overturn the conviction or the sentence. But as his execution date approached in 2011, something unusual happened. Members of his own family, including relatives of the child he had killed, came forward asking the state to spare his life. They argued that executing Adams would not heal their wounds, that they had already lost one child, and that losing another family member would only deepen their grief. Even the mother of the boy, Bridget, signed pleas for clemency. Despite the unusual support from the victim's family, the courts declined to intervene. On February 22, 2011, Timothy Wayne Adams was led into the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. He was strapped to the gurney as witnesses looked on, many of them family members torn between love, grief, and rage. In his final statement, Adams apologized. He said he was sorry for the pain he had caused, sorry for the life he had taken, and that his actions had destroyed the very thing he loved most. Those were his last words. Moments later, the lethal injection was administered. He was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. For some, the execution was justice served. For others, it was simply another tragedy, another death in a case already defined by loss. Even among his family, feelings were mixed. Some believed he deserved his fate. Others believed his death only compounded the pain that began the night he pulled the trigger. The case of Timothy Wayne Adams is remembered as one of the most heartbreaking in Texas criminal history. It is not just the story of a murder, but of a father who lost everything to his own despair and anger. It is a case with no winners, only grief. A child was taken in the cruelest way imaginable. A family was torn apart, and a man who could not control his rage paid with his life. Years later, people still struggle to understand how it happened. How a father could sit for hours with his child, surrounded by negotiators begging him to stop, and still choose death. It remains a chilling reminder of how quickly despair can turn to destruction, and how unchecked emotions can lead to irreversible tragedy. Timothy Wayne Adams's story is not just a crime, it is a cautionary tale of how love, when poisoned by control and pride, can twist into something unrecognizable. His son, Timothy Jr., would have been a young man today. Instead, his name lives on only in court records and family memories, as the innocent victim of his father's irreversible choice.